Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Archaeology After Dark. My name is Daniel Rhodes, and my guest today is Dr. Gareth Roberts. Gareth, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So tell us a little bit about yourself.
So, as you know, my name is Gareth Roberts. As you can probably tell, even though this is Philadelphia behind me, I did not grow up in Philadelphia. I'm from a small town in northern Wales. Which, since we're talking about language today, is sort of interesting from the point of view of a lot of people in Britain, because we have two languages in that part of the UK, Welsh and English. Which also, as it happens, has a connection with Philadelphia, because a lot of Welsh Quaker settlers arrived in the 18th century. So you have a lot of Welsh place names around here. You have a few dotted elsewhere in the US as well. And I am in Philadelphia because I am now an associate professor of linguistics at the University of Pennsylvania.
So that leads us to our topic today. We're talking about language, linguistics, and the way people communicate with each other. I think this is something that continuously, well, I guess I should say I know it continuously evolves, because language is something that I feel changes on almost a daily basis.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. And I think that sometimes that's something people, as you say, are sort of often aware of. They kind of notice it day to day. They notice maybe, so an obvious thing people notice is, I know that their kids maybe are using slang words that they weren't familiar with before that, or they notice that there are sort of new words coming in, things like that. But also, lots of things change in language, not just introduction of new words. If you look over longer periods of time, you see how pronunciations change, and sometimes that can happen relatively quickly. And I think, and it's sometimes, I think, in spite of noticing this, I think people are sometimes not entirely aware, or they sort of forget that language is just kind of changing all the time around us. It sometimes takes us by surprise when we catch up with it a little bit later, and we find actually there's been quite a lot of change between two different points in history. So.
Yeah, an anthropology professor I had a few years ago, the first thing she does on the first day of class is she wants you to write down the 10 words you use the most. And she says the list she collects from students, and she puts it into like 100-word list, is never the same from year to year, or actually by semester. It changes on a semester basis. And for those of you who are looking at that as a time frame, that's a 2 or 3 month period. It changes that often.
That's a fantastic idea, by the way. Actually, I'm going to start doing that. I think that's a great idea for.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I didn't know how to spell some of the words that I was writing. But it's a great exercise, and I can see why she, it helps her keep up with communicating with her students on a way that they can understand. But it also, monitors the way change occurs, just not just in language, but as society, really.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. I mean, I think there's also this other thing, though. Maybe you mentioned sort of helps you communicate with your students, but there's always also this sort of interesting thing where there are also these social dimensions, right? There are kind of things which change, but they don't necessarily change for all of us. So they don't comfortably change for all of us. So there's words which there's sort of slang which you might have used, say, this is usually slang comes into this category where you were a kid, you might have used particular slang words, and now there's kind of, those words have been replaced, and kids of the age you were when you were using those words, using different words that you may or may not feel comfortable using those. You may kind of feel a bit left out. Your kids may use them, and your kids kind of give you this look. I think there's always these interesting social dimensions come into this as well.
Yeah, we did a student-led project a few months ago, and it was a lot of younger kids, and I'm not gonna lie, I had a hard time understanding what kids were actually saying to me. I'm like, what are you saying to me right now? Are you speaking English?
Indeed. I mean, some of these, and even when you understand the words, I mean, my kids, for example, I don't know if they use this so much, but for a while recently, and I think this has been around for a while, they were calling things sick to mean good. This is sick. I know that's been around for a while, but I don't I don't know how, if I'd started saying to them, oh yeah, you should do this, it's sick. I think the reaction would have just been kind of raised eyebrows.
Yeah, I used the word sick to my mom once, and she asked me if I was feeling okay. Like she thought I was sick, and I was like, No, I'm fine. I'm just telling you this is good. This is a good thing that's happening right now."
Indeed, indeed. I mean, I have the extra dimension of not being from around here, of course, which complicates things. But
So, for just for fun, I Googled actually how many words there are in the English language, and it told me that there are over 171,000 words in the English language, which honestly, after I thought about it for a couple of minutes, seemed kind of low.
it might be, and I mean, I think it depends on how you want to count these things. You should always take this with a pinch of salt, right? I mean, there's gonna be, I think people are often surprised, first of all, by how many words they know. I mean, really, really thousands and thousands and thousands. We all know thousands of words. But as you say, sometimes it's kind of surprising. We kind of are aware of this, and we think of all the different, how many people across the world speak English, and we think of the size of, I know, the Oxford English Dictionary, right? If you've ever seen that and all those volumes, it's a huge number of words. But there's always these tricky decisions about what to count, right? I mean, there's tons and tons of scientific, technical words which the average person is never going to use or even hear within their lifetime. There's words which are perhaps used only a handful of times because they're only used in this very, very specific circumstance. And then you have the sort of decision about, well, if I was to come up with a word, like, there are sort of words which we can sort of form naturally in English and everyone understands what you mean, but we wouldn't say that those are words which we necessarily write in the dictionary. I don't know, take a sort of, trying to think of a good example, but let's say, I think this is a phone. I think this looks a lot like a phone. I think this is really phony. Bad choice, but that's a bad choice. Let's take a different, phony is already just a word. Let's say, this is a watch, right? I think this is a really watchy watch. So we want to talk about the watchiness of this watch. We might not want to write the word watchiness in the dictionary. We might think, well, that'd be kind of silly if dictionary compilers added that word that I just invented just now. But it's, you know, it's a word. It works in English. So there's always that kind of space where there's always this, the grammar allows you to create a lot of new words on the fly. Yeah, I think these decisions are always of how to count words and how many words are around a language it's always a very kind of vague, nebulous figure.
Yeah, and I think that leads us to our next, I guess subject is how do we, chronicle the change in language over time? Because the English we speak now here in the United States, I would probably assume is a night and day difference than the English people used when they first arrived here.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say night and day. I mean, if we're thinking back to sort of 16th century English, right, compared with now, think of the Jamestown, that kind of thing. I mean, I think it's certainly very different, and you notice a difference if you go and find. So I think if John Smith, for example, well known from the story of Pocahontas, wrote a history of Virginia, and this is readable. You can find this and you can read this now, and you might have to look up some words, but you can read this, and most people who speak modern American English can more or less understand this, having to look up a few words and so on. And the same thing, this is around the same sort of era as Shakespeare, right? So if we, and there's a reason that we're able to give Shakespeare to school kids in high school to read. It's difficult, but it's not so difficult that you can't pick up Shakespeare or watch Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet and basically understand what's going on. So it's very different, but I think if we go back further before that, we go back to something that Chaucer, for instance, Middle English, we find it's much more, it's much more difficult, I think, to try and follow what's going on. Then we get back, to Old English, which we've spoken before, 1066 and Norman Conquest, and we get back to a language which really looks very, very different from Old English. You really need a lot more training to understand it. So to get back, so I think there's this, I would say, so Old English feels like night and day, and as we get more towards Jamestown, Shakespeare, that kind of era, we're talking about early modern English, which is, I'd say it's a bit like day and dusk. It's that sort of period between, as we transition, if you like, between different periods of language, we get more towards language we understand today. And I suppose to answer your question about how we sort of identify these changes, it comes down to comparison, right? It comes down to looking at language in the past, at some point in the past, looking at language now, and looking at how these things have changed and comparing them. And that raises a lot of questions and difficulties, which we can talk about if you like. But I don't know how much you want to get into those.
Well, I mean, that's what this show is for, to get into things that people, don't normally have time to talk about. So everyone can know what people are talking about.
So this is, if you think about one of the difficulties here, let's take a sort of really simple example where you say, well, let's take a slightly different example what I had in mind. Let's consider the British English word for the trunk of a car. So back when I was growing up, we called that the boot, right? People in the US don't tend to use the word boot, we tend to call it the trunk. Let's imagine that 1,000 years from now, we want to find out how people spoke in the English in the 21st century and compare it with how people speak 1,000 years from now. And let's imagine you invent your own apocalyptic scenario. Let's imagine that the only example of English that survives the 21st century are some car manuals from England. People looking through these, they say, okay, so 21st century English, people called the trunk of the car the boot. Nowadays, everyone calls it the trunk, right? And this would be a comparison, right, between two periods of English. In some sense, you're doing the right kind of thing, but obviously this is kind of misleading. You're missing out on this information from the past. And this is something we have to worry about if we're trying to compare two different periods in language. We have this problem sometimes that we only have documentary evidence of the language from certain places or certain times, and we have gaps we need to fill. We need to make sure we're comparing like with like. A better case scenario, of course, if the ideal scenario is if you can actually take the same family in the same place and look at how their language changes over time. If you're lucky enough to have that kind of recording. Even then you get some difficulties if you don't have enough evidence. So let's imagine that we take a really, really simple case. Let's say I'm interested in how much your language has changed over the last 20 years, right? We started talking about that. Let's say I go back and find a recording of you talking 20 years ago, and you happen to use the word somebody. And now I look at a recording of you now, and you happen to use the word someone. And we could conclude from that, well, 20 years ago, you used to say somebody, and now there's been change, you say someone now. But it's probably the case that you sometimes say somebody and sometimes say someone. So we have to deal with this kind of variation. We have to get as much data as possible and make sure that we're really comparing like with like. Take a sort of interesting, fairly topical example to give you an example of how people's language does change over their lifetimes. As most people know, Elizabeth II just died.
Yeah. And
she's someone we might imagine had a very kind of conservative speech patterns, right? I mean, we probably imagine that she was pretty posh. And we sort of think that it's probably not the case that someone who is relatively sheltered, lives in an actual palace, whose language is not going to change radically over her lifetime. But we actually have some really nice data on this because we have a number of recordings of the Queen. And one of the really nice examples of this is that the Queen used to give a Christmas broadcast every year. So every Christmas there would be broadcast on television where she'd speak to her subjects. And we have this broadcast of her saying the same kind of things in the same kind of circumstances and the same kind of style. There's a very, very similar kind of context. And there's a nice fun paper by Jonathan Harrington from a number of years ago where he actually compared how the Queen said certain words over the course of her reign and found that actually she changed how she pronounced certain things. So earlier in her reign, she would pronounce the word happy, kind of like happy, terribly happy. You get a sense of this sort of posh, old-fashioned received pronunciation. But over the course of her reign, her language actually shifted to be a little closer to the way other people in England were speaking. So happy become more like happy. So there's I to E change, happy. happy, this kind of change at the end of the word. So this kind of change happening within the lifetime of a single individual. And that brings its own complications. So if you think about, I mentioned before, we might ideally want to get recordings from members of the same family, the same place over multiple generations. The problem with this is, researchers have a limited lifespan. So if I want to go back and record people in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, etc., up to now, well, I'm not going to be able to do that. I have to rely on the fact that someone else did that. So one thing that we sometimes do, if we don't necessarily have that kind of data, is we say, well, let's take a proxy for that. Let's do what's called an apparent time study, where we take different generations of the same family now. We'll visit a family, perhaps ideally a family who've all been living in the same kind of area throughout their lives, so they haven't moved and had different influences, unless that's what we're interested in. But if we're interested in how languages change in a particular region, we might say, well, we'll talk to grandma, grandpa, then we'll see their kids. If we're lucky enough, maybe we've even got a great-grandparent, and so on and so on. And we'll record them in different styles. So maybe reading a list of words so that we should expect them to be pronounced those a particular way. And then there's a sort of approach where you sit down, you try and make people forget that you're recording them. So you just start chatting with them. You say, don't worry, we're just recording you. Don't worry about that. We'll start chatting and get them sort of engrossed in the conversation. And they forget they're being recorded. And then you get some very natural speech from them. If you do that over different generations, you can get some kind of idea of how the languages change over those generations, with the caveat, of course, that even the Queen's language changed over her lifetime. So what we're getting from Grandpa is probably not quite how Grandpa used to talk when Grandpa was a young man. It's going to have changed a bit over his lifetime, but probably not as much as languages change between Grandpa and his kids and their kids and so on.
Yeah, and if you're, like my relatives, the older you get, the looser you get with the vocabulary you use in front of children.
Yeah, that's definitely something that changes, I think. Depends a bit on the people, but yeah, that's the thing that happens, and that could be kind of interesting.
Yeah, it may. You hear their opinions on something when you're growing up, and it's very, toned down, and then you hit 18 and the full opinion comes out. Wow. Yeah.
No.
Learned a lot of words, learned a lot of new words that 18th birthday.
Yeah. No, this is something that happens. Indeed.
I was talking to a colleague yesterday. She had been on a project in the Caribbean, and she was having to work with shipping records from the Dutch East India Company. She was on a team of, I think she said 10 or 12 people. The only person who could actually read and speak Dutch was the project director. So she was having to translate, 18th century Dutch into English with records that are spotty at best, because
sure,
they may or may not have been from privateers.
Yeah, indeed.
So indeed. They're having to omit some things from the story, in the records, but still having to put together the entire story from a written account that, like I said, has holes in
it. That's really interesting. I mean, is this something where there are kind of this sort of information from the privateers that's still kind of sensitive, even, or?
I don't know if it's necessarily sensitive, but this is back during the American Revolution or the War for Independence, yes, whatever you want to call it. But it's still showing that how Dutch was written and how few people in that area still speak it now.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very strong, that kind of change, the sort of make up the different languages you get spoken in different areas is really striking. I mean, give you a sort of example close to my heart. When Abraham Lincoln was campaigning, there were enough Welsh speakers in, I think, Scranton and other parts of eastern US that they actually published quite a lot of pamphlets in Welsh, campaigning on behalf of Abraham Lincoln, which we forget about this. I mean, Dutch, obviously, you don't meet many people day to day that actually speak Dutch in the modern US, unless they happen to be from the Netherlands, and there aren't as many of those now.
Yeah, I think English, as we understand it here in the United States, has blended so much that, it's something that when people come here, they either feel a requirement to learn it, or they slide into it easy enough to where it's not like a super difficult transition.
Yeah, and I think, I think there are a couple of things going on there. One is that, if you move into I'll step back to that. I think we think of language learning very often as language learning in adulthood is really difficult, right? If we've been to language classes, you've used Duolingo to learn a language. Some of us, some people find this very easy, or at least very enjoyable, so they're very motivated to it, and for that reason it feels easy. But most of us, I think, when we're learning new languages as adults, we find this kind of hard work, right? But I think part of that, so it is hard work. It's even hard work for kids. Kids don't really necessarily notice it's hard work, but it takes them a reasonably long time. There's a lot to learn. Their brain's doing a lot of work in the background. It just feels fairly easy for them. For adults, it kind of feels harder. But a part of that is that we're learning the language very often in a context like a classroom or something, where we're not hearing the language around us all the time. It doesn't really have that kind of bearing on our everyday life that it might do. Whereas, if you're a recent immigrant to a community, and let's say you're not in a community with lots of people who speak your native language, it's difficult in a certain sense, but it's usually somewhat easier to learn the language, because if you have to use it, you have that sort of everyday motivational pressure. You hear the language constantly. You get an enormous amount of linguistic data, and I think that kind of immigrant experience, where you have a language like English, especially. This has become increasingly true, of course, originally through the British Empire, now Power of America, American culture. English is one of those languages which is so common throughout the world. Most people in the world will have been exposed to some English, even when they're quite young, wherever they are. And once you end up in an English-speaking community, there's so much English around you. Typically, that it's very hard not to switch that. And I think as well in the American context. Lost my earbud. I think as well in the American context, America for a long time has had this sense of itself as a melting pot, but also a melting pot where you want to stir the pot. You want to kind of form a single country, a single nation. My kids do the Pledge of Allegiance every morning in school, which is not something that typically anyone, I think, in Europe does. And I think part of that is wanting to create a country where you have a melting pot. You want to bring people together and have them feel part of a single nation. I think and language, I think, plays into that.
You brought up a really good point. I traveled through several European countries when I was a kid, and I didn't have time to learn a complete language when I was going to, say, France or Germany. But I lucked out when I go through those countries. There were enough things written in English that I didn't walk into the women's bathroom by mistake.
Indeed. Yeah. And this is the thing about English. If English is your first language, well, you've lucked out in lots of ways, because most places in the world you go, it's not too hard to find someone who speaks English. This might change, of course, over the next century or two. But we're currently at this point in history, it's not too hard to be an English speaker traveling.
Yeah, and that's, something that I think people, don't actually take into account when they travel to another country, that while those countries will have things in English, not everything you need will be in English.
Yeah.
Like in France and Germany, especially France and Germany, you will see, like, especially their currency will not have any English on it. It will have French and German on it. So you need to learn at least, basic communication, like, where the train is or something like that, or the bathroom. The bathroom is something that I cannot overstate how important it is to know how to ask for in another country.
Yeah, this is absolutely true. Yeah, and I think people, I think, sometimes underestimate or don't don't know what to expect from visiting different countries. Yeah, they think they probably get by in English for everything, and sometimes you can, but some countries it's harder than others, and most countries there's going to be places where maybe you need the bathroom, and there doesn't happen to be anyone around who speaks English. You're going to really need to be able to ask in that language, or as you suggested before, be able to tell. Well, if the men's and the women's bathrooms are labeled with, say, the first letter of the word for man and the first letter of the word for woman, well, what are those letters going to be? How are you going to know which bathroom to go to? So yeah, this is a useful travel tip is, as you say, learn how to distinguish the bathrooms and how to find them.
I mean, if you learn one thing from this episode, learn how to identify bathrooms in foreign countries. That's what this program is really all about.
This is really what linguistics as a field is devoted to, is helping people find bathrooms. It's the main everyday thing.
What you do is a community service.
Indeed.
So we're about to wrap it up here. Say people are interested in learning more or studying linguistics. What advice would you give them?
I mean, first of all, that's a great idea. You should, because I'll give you a couple of reasons. First of all, maybe why that's a good idea, and then maybe sort of give some advice if that sounds good.
Yeah, that's perfect.
So I think first of all, there are jobs you can do that involve language. For example, you could become a linguistics professor. Although this is, there are only academia is not necessarily a career I'd recommend to people in this, given how small the job market is currently. But there are lots of research positions. There are research positions available. There are jobs available in tech and so on. But also, I think language is one of those things that people tend to feel they sort of know a bit about. We all know a little bit about language. We pretty much all speak a language. With very, very unusual exceptions here. We all speak languages. We understand that language is an important part of everyday life, and we all feel we know a bit about it. But people are often know a little bit, and there's that danger of knowing a little bit and not knowing enough. So people will sometimes speak fairly authoritatively on language and be completely wrong. Bloody linguistics helps you to be less wrong. And it's also very often quite fun. There's a lot of really interesting sort of facts and tidbits that you can pick up learning linguistics. I think one of these things that, because we all speak language, we all have it around us all the time, people often find very interesting as well. I'd say if you want to get into it, I think you have a couple of different options. One option, of course, is buy some nice books on linguistics. And there are some, there are a few sort of fun ones. I mean, one nice one that a lot of people have been talking about over the last couple of years, which is concerned with internet language and how different things that have happened with language, let's say, given modern technology. It's called Because Internet by Gretchen McCulloch, and that's a book that a lot of people have, I strongly recommend. A lot of people have really enjoyed recently. And there are different, if anyone wants to follow me on Twitter or send me an email or something, I'm happy to recommend other readings that people might be interested in. Or, find a class online. These big online courses people can take in linguistics. There's some fantastic options out there. Perhaps you're lucky enough where you are, and perhaps you're a student, you have a chance to take a linguistics class. It's really, I'd really recommend, if you're interested at all, take an intro to linguistics class if you have that opportunity. And if you don't have any classes around you, there's a ton of great books out there. But look for books which are written by people who know about language. There are a few books out there, as I say, which are written by people who think they know about language, but are perhaps not actually, perhaps they don't actually know as much as they think. This is a book which seems to do a lot of finger wagging about what you should and shouldn't say. I'm not saying I'd recommend that book so much. Those usually aren't written by people who know quite so much about language. Linguists tend to do a bit less. Linguists sometimes wag their fingers at self-appointed authorities on language, but not so much on the topic of what you should and shouldn't say.
Well, I think that's going to wrap it up for today. Gareth, thanks so much for being here. I really enjoyed having you on the show.
Not at all. Thank you, and great to meet you.
You too. All right, everybody, tune in for us next time, and we will see you then. Bye.